Heat still escaped from the surface of the skin. Human flesh, served on a ritual bronze plate, exhaled the same metallic aroma as the sacrifice altars of the imperial temple. The condemned man, kneeling, kept his eyes fixed on the void. But it was impossible to ignore what lay before him, a piece of the body that brought him into the world. Before the court elders, the woman's body had already been divided with ritual precision. The inscriptions on the utensils did not name victims, they named the gods. And among the celestial laws of that time, one was immutable. Whoever breaks the bond with the emperor also breaks with heaven, with the clan, and with their own birth. What you just heard is not legend nor invention meant to shock. It is a forgotten and real part of a history that books prefer to silence. An era when obedience to the throne was measured by pain and by flesh, where children were forced to prove that the blood of the empire was worth more than the blood of their own mother. And if you, like me, enjoy real stories that challenge what books tell us, check if you're already subscribed to the channel. And tell me in the comments which country you're watching from. I'm always curious to know. In the Shang dynasty, ruling was not merely a matter of power, it was a divine mission. The king was not seen as a man, but as the direct link between heaven and earth. He carried the mandate of heaven, and his will represented cosmic balance. Disobeying imperial authority was not just a political error, it was considered a spiritual crime against the order of the universe. Therefore, punishments never aimed merely to eliminate the traitor's body. They sought to erase his lineage, purify his origin, and restore, through pain, the harmony of the empire. It was a society where blood spoke louder than any written law. Every gesture, every word, every ritual was imbued with ancestral meaning. Punishments were planned with care, conducted with solemnity, and witnessed by counselors who believed they were serving the gods. There was no improvisation. Everything was calculated to reach not just the flesh, but eternity. The punishment of a traitorous son was, above all, an offering. The empire needed to prove that its purity was greater than affection, that celestial order was more sacred than blood ties. Therefore, in the most extreme cases, when the traitor was a direct descendant, a son, an heir, a member of nobility, the empire used a punishment reserved for those who touched the heart of the throne with disobedience, the ritual of consuming maternal flesh. It was not enough to imprison. It was not enough to execute. It was necessary to invert birth, reverse the bond, nullify the origin. And this would only be possible if the son himself chewed the flesh of the woman who gave him life. Before the eyes of the council, with bare hands and face marked by shame, the traitor ceased to be a man and became a symbol. A living warning that in ancient China, even a mother's love could be sacrificed to keep the crown of heaven intact. But what was most frightening was not death. It was what they came to take before it: honor. In Shang culture, a man's name was his eternity. Being in clan records, having one's name engraved on ceremonial bronzes, being remembered in ancestral rituals, all this defined what would remain of him after death. Therefore, punishments against traitors aimed not only to take life, but to erase history. And for sons who rose against imperial order, the fate was crueler than decapitation. It was the dissolution of identity. Records tell that before the punishment ritual, the prisoner was stripped of his titles, disassociated from lineage, and forbidden from receiving prayers after death. In spiritual terms, this was a second execution, deeper, more definitive. It was not enough to kill the body. It was necessary to destroy the name, break the link with ancestors, erase the blood from family memory. And the first step of this process was always the same: publicly dishonor the source of life. Forcing the son to eat his own mother's flesh was not merely an act of brutality. It was a public declaration that he had already lost the right to be remembered as a man. The mother, killed as an accomplice to the crime, was reduced to food. The son, reduced to devourer of his own origin, and both their names, absent from ritual records, became empty echoes, forgotten from generation to generation. Honor, which once clothed them like a sacred mantle, was torn away with the same coldness with which priests cut flesh. There, before the eyes of the empire, dignity died before the person. And the judgment of this type of dishonor did not happen amid applause or crowds. The sentence was sealed in the cruelest silence an empire ever cultivated. The Shang court did not need voice to pronounce condemnation. The most brutal judgments of the dynasty happened far from squares, far from markets, far from families. They were conducted in closed stone chambers, on the margins of imperial temples, where the flickering light of oil lamps seemed weaker than the air. There was no clamor, no audience, only the weight of the elders' eyes and the thick smell of blood, incense and fear. The silence was not by chance. It was part of the ritual. Because a crime against royal lineage did not deserve human noise, it deserved the judgment of heaven. Therefore, those present abstained from speaking. Judges did not shout. They only pointed. The condemned, kneeling on a cold stone block, heard the sentence not through words, but through gestures. A raised staff, a ceremonial mask turned toward him. A bell rung twice. That was enough for him to know. Fate was sealed. While preparations were initiated, the defendant received no defense. He was considered unworthy of arguments. And in the most serious cases, like that of traitorous sons, silence also served to mark total rupture. From that moment on, that man no longer belonged to anyone. He had no father, he had no mother, he had no name. He was merely a vessel of ancestral guilt, ready to be returned to earth, but not as a man, rather as a living warning. The mother, in turn, had already been removed from the cycle of the living. Killed by ceremonial strangulation or sacred poison, her body was prepared according to the same rites as an offering, washed, perfumed, and divided with precision. But unlike common victims, she would not be placed on an altar. She would be served as the final course to her own son, in the same chamber where, minutes before, he had had his face shaved as a sign of submission. There was no scream. There was no word. Only the reverberation of tragedy, absorbed in silence by the temple pillars, as if the empire itself preferred not to hear what it had just decreed. But while the son remained motionless before the verdict, trained hands were already moving. Because in the Shang dynasty, even the body was divided according to the principles of heaven. The post-mortem mutilation of a woman was never done in haste, especially when the destiny of her flesh was not cremation, but ritual consumption. In the silent chambers of the palace, the mother's body was positioned on a polished stone table, while court priests initiated a procedure that united surgical precision and religious devotion. Each part removed followed an order determined by oracles. First the arms, then the thighs, finally the torso, everything recorded on bamboo strips covered with sacred inscriptions. The plates used in this ritual were not common. They were bronze vessels cast especially for occasions of ancestral punishment, with inscriptions that invoked the spirits of ancestors to witness the act. In some cases, the edges of the pieces bore drawings of dragons, indicating that the flesh served there was reserved for the restoration of cosmic order. This was not common cannibalism, it was state liturgy, a way to spiritually disconnect the son from the womb that conceived him. These containers had no beautiful adornments, only marks of command. Some vessels bore holes for ties on their sides, as if even the plates, so loaded with guilt, needed to be contained. It was on these pieces that the fragments of the executed woman rested, a piece of the arm that had cradled him, a part of the thigh that had supported him, and, in more extreme cases, even parts of the face, as a final symbol of humiliation. Nothing was improvised. The flesh was lightly cooked with bitter herbs, not to improve the taste, but to maintain the intense and penetrating odor. The empire wanted the son to never forget what he chewed. It wanted the taste of guilt to stick to the roof of his mouth like an invisible scar. When placed before these vessels, the condemned did not see just flesh. He saw chapters of his own childhood, now transformed into sentence. And he knew that from then on, each bite was not just punishment. It was the ceremonial end of what was once called home. But before lips moved, before teeth fulfilled the decree, it was in the eyes that true torment began. Most accounts that survived about these rituals do not mention screams, they mention gaze. The condemned was not forced to eat immediately. First, he had to face what was served, and mainly recognize each part. It was part of the rupture process, looking into the eyes of death and seeing there the reflection of the womb that generated him. Many broke at this point, not from physical pain, but because the mind refused to accept that what lay before them was real. In Shang culture, eyes had a symbolic role. It was believed they were direct channels to ancestors and gods. Looking at the mother's body was not just a farewell, it was spiritual testimony. The son, upon recognizing each mutilated part, confirmed with his gaze that he understood his guilt and accepted his punishment. Not looking was disrespect, but looking too much was losing sanity. The pain began when eyes found what remained of the face. In some cases, the features were still visible, the mouth slightly parted, the outline of eyelids intact, the chin tilted to one side, as if there were still traces of expression. For the condemned, that was not just the image of the dead mother. It was the image of childhood being forcibly torn away before everyone without escape, as if the last memory of love was now lying in silence, waiting to be consumed. There are accounts in later texts written under the Zhou dynasty that mention prisoners who collapsed upon seeing their mother's face on the altar. Some lost consciousness. Others began screaming childhood names, as if trying to call back what the empire had already decided to destroy. But nothing stopped the ritual. Nothing moved the council. Pain, there, was not an argument. It was part of the process. Because in that cold room, surrounded by coals, bronze, and silence, the true beginning of punishment did not happen in the stomach. It began in the eyes, and slowly descended, until it tore the soul from within. But for the court, pain was not a problem. On the contrary, it was a tool, because the suffering of a son before his mother's body was also a lesson that needed to be seen. Despite all the silence surrounding the judgment, there were moments when pain needed to be exposed, not for the victim, but for others. In certain cases, especially when the condemned was a member of a powerful lineage or had popular influence, the second part of the ritual was open to a restricted audience: officials, counselors, court apprentices, and, occasionally, children of nobility. The objective was not justice. It was pedagogy. Those who watched could not speak, intervene, or even look away. They sat in rows, with heads raised, before the ritual stage where the condemned, still with face dirty with blood and trembling hands, was forced to eat before everyone. This was not vulgar spectacle. It was a rehearsal of power. The empire wanted each present official to take home not just the memory of flesh, but the certainty that the throne would never forgive disobedience, even when born from the womb of one's own mother. Some accounts indicate that during these public rituals, spectators were also tested. Anyone who looked away or showed repulsion could be accused of disrespecting imperial order. There was a cruel balance in the room. One man eating the remains of the woman who raised him, and dozens of others forced to watch in silence, as if that were the most natural thing in the world. The power of the scene lay not just in horror, but in repetition. The same plate, the same table, the same absence of mercy. The council believed that fear was the only wall between order and chaos, and that by exposing a traitor feeding on his own guilt, they sealed the fate of those who still thought of questioning the throne. In ancient China, Learning from others' suffering was not metaphor, it was doctrine. And in this theatre of horror, each bite was also a warning. Whoever challenges heaven tastes the flesh that generated them. But to the court's eyes, that was not savagery. It was not crime. It was right, and in the spiritual logic of the Shang dynasty, it was not cannibalism. It was purification. In the ritual understanding of the Shang dynasty, the most extreme acts of punishment were not considered barbaric, but necessary. The empire believed that disorder was born within families before spreading through the provinces. And therefore, when a son committed a transgression against the throne, it was not enough to execute him. It was necessary to spiritually correct his lineage. The consumption of one's own blood's flesh was seen, therefore, as a process of expiation, a sacred means of returning guilt to the womb from which it came. The practice was based on ancestral cosmology. Everything born from flesh returns to flesh. And if betrayal began in the womb, then punishment should return to the source. This reasoning, however cruel it may sound to the modern eye, was treated with solemnity and sacredness. The son was not just forced to eat, he was led to absorb the failure, seal the cycle of error with his own body, and symbolically end the dishonor of his house. Archaeological documents and later inscriptions reveal that these practices were accompanied by low chants and rhythmic beats on ceremonial stones. The repetition of sounds helped maintain the rhythm of the ritual, while spectators, priests and counselors remained motionless, watching the condemned consume piece by piece. There was no hurry. Time was part of the punishment. More than punishment, the empire saw in that gesture a spiritual cleansing. As if by devouring the flesh of the woman who generated him, the son was, in a way, trying to return to the universe the error committed. It was a way to undo birth, a reversal of the cycle of life, as if saying, this is no longer a man. It is the closure of a flawed lineage. The throne believed this with fervor, and therefore official annals did not call the ritual punishment nor execution. They called it restitution. For them, justice was done, not because a son was punished, but because heaven was rebalanced, and the empire clean once again. But there were moments when the ritual exceeded the limits of death, because not always was the mother dead when the punishment began. Although the most common accounts mention the mother's body already lifeless being prepared for the ritual, there are fragmented and controversial records that indicate something even more terrifying. In cases of high treason involving imperial lineages, the sacrifice could be conducted with the victim still alive. The woman was sedated with narcotic herbs or kept in a trance, induced by breathing techniques and repetitive chants. The objective was to prolong her consciousness during the first cuts, not for explicit torture, but as part of a greater rite of spiritual restitution. The logic behind this cruelty followed the same ancestral doctrine. If life had come from the mother, the error had also begun in her. Therefore, she should witness the reparation, even if it were in her final moments. Some later documents, such as the moral records of the Zhou dynasty, explicitly condemn such practices, but at the same time describe them in sufficient detail for historians to consider them plausible, especially in an era where the king's power was seen as direct authority from heaven, and where the woman's flesh was not inviolable, but rather property of the clan. The woman, in these cases, was kept motionless, with her face turned toward her son. The cuts were made meticulously, with sharp instruments used in animal sacrifices, but now turned toward one's own blood. The removed flesh was immediately served, still warm, and the son, under the court's eyes, was urged to eat. Not as an act of revenge, but of purification, of maximum submission, of total denial of the origin that generated the betrayal. The accounts do not mention what was said in these moments. only that the environment remained in absolute silence, broken only by the sound of cutting and chewing. The empire did not want audible pain. It wanted ritual. It wanted order. It wanted to show to all present and to invisible ancestors that no emotion was stronger than imperial authority. And so, while the body still pulsed, the sentence was fulfilled, not as punishment, not as justice, but as doctrine. In an empire where heaven was more sacred than blood, even a mother's love could be dismantled, still breathing. But even when the flesh was digested and the ritual was concluded, something remained untouched and corrupted forever: the son's mind. Because what came after was not forgetfulness, it was madness. No condemned man returned the same after the ritual. Shang justice was precise, meticulous, calculated to restore order, but not to preserve sanity. The empire wanted submission, not emotional survival, and that is why the oldest accounts describe, with strange coldness, what happened in the days following the act of devouring one's own mother. The son's body remained whole, but his mind fragmented. Records from the Zhou dynasty, which condemned the extreme practices of the Shang, cite cases of prisoners who, even after being freed, never spoke again. They spent their days in absolute silence, with their gaze fixed on emptiness, responding neither to their own names. Others screamed disconnected phrases at night, calling for their mothers, biting their fingers, rubbing their faces on the ground as if wanting to tear away something invisible. There were even those who tried to feed on earth or stones, as if the body, already profaned, sought to punish itself once more. But the empire did not treat them as sick. It treated them as examples. The sons who survived the ritual were not killed. They were kept alive within the palaces themselves, sometimes locked in windowless rooms, sometimes fed by servants in silence, as if they were relics of a lesson that needed to be preserved. They became living specters of a warning. This is what remains of those who dare to break the sacred bond of obedience. Curiously, these men had no right to honorable death. They received no ancestral burial, nor would their names be cited in future offerings. To the living, they were dead. To the dead, they did not exist. And to themselves, they were merely ruins. They carried in their stomachs the memory of the unthinkable, and in their eyes a weight that not even the gods would dare to carry. In many cases, they ceased to be called by their names. They received generic titles: the mute son, he who devoured guilt, he who does not sleep. And so they spent their days between shadows and murmurs, carrying in their own bodies the living memory of an empire that, to preserve its order, was willing to destroy even the sanity of those born within it. But what no one expected is that, in some cases, it was the mother herself who asked to die, not for honor, but for love. Amid the institutionalized brutality of the Shang dynasty, there were scarce but striking accounts of women who did not wait for the court's verdict. They knew what would come. They knew that when a son was accused of treason against the throne, the punishment would not be his alone. Blood would be traced to its origin. The womb would be accused along with the voice. And therefore, some decided to present themselves beforehand, without bonds, without flight, only with the hope of avoiding the worst. These mothers did not seek absolution. They knew they would not be spared. But by voluntarily surrendering themselves to the temple, they offered the empire a body without need for capture, without scandal, without resistance. In exchange, or perhaps as a final gesture of mercy, some managed to reduce the weight of punishment on their sons. There are inscriptions on oracle bones and bamboo fragments that mention terms like voluntary flesh offering and substitution through love, associated with internal court judgments. In these cases, the ritual continued, but with subtle alterations. The son would still be forced to eat, but did not always witness the death. The flesh was served with less public display, names were not erased from records with the same severity, and the ceremony was conducted with a more restrained tone. For the elders, it was not clemency. It was protocol. But for the sons who survived, that silent gesture from the mother was an act of absolute sacrifice. Later chronicles treat these women as tragic symbols of family loyalty, but also as marks of the collapse of a system where love had to die for the empire to remain alive. Some oral songs preserved by peoples of China's interior still carry verses with double meaning. She did not cry when she was taken. She cried when her son tried to stop her. These were not religious laments. They were surviving memories of a time when the purest affection bowed to the most sacred fear. And so these mothers entered the temples as women and left as offerings, not from weakness, but because, deep down, they knew the empire could take everything, except a mother's right to decide how to protect her son, even if it were with her own flesh. But when the ritual ended, and the bodies had already been removed, the empire left one final reminder, something that could not be hidden, because there were faces that never returned to being washed. At the end of the ritual, the condemned was not authorized to clean his face. It was part of the ceremonial protocol. The mother's blood, still fresh, salty, thick, ran down his mouth, descended down his chin, accumulated in the furrows of his neck. But no towel was offered, no basin, no drop of water. For 7 days, that face should remain as it was, marked, dirty, soaked with the guilt that the empire wished to eternalize. This practice was not just aesthetic punishment, it was a seal. It was believed that washing the face before the determined time would weaken the spiritual effect of the punishment. Blood was not seen as dirt, but as scripture. The stained face became the living parchment of a new identity. No longer son, no longer noble, no longer man, only restored defendant, flesh transformed into warning. During this week, the condemned was kept in ritual seclusion, but under surveillance. He slept sitting up, with eyes open for long periods. He received liquid food without seasoning and was forbidden from touching his own face with his hands. Any attempt to clean himself was interpreted as contempt for the celestial decree and, in some cases, resulted in immediate execution. The order was clear. Whoever dared to erase the traces of error did not deserve to continue breathing. Those who obeyed lived, but never looked in mirrors again. Some tore pieces of beard or hair in silence, as if trying to extract what had infiltrated within. Others scratched their faces with nails until bleeding again. Not from repentance, but from desperation of not forgetting. Because for many of them, the fear was not remembering. It was becoming indifferent to what they had done. There are later accounts of monks and scribes who visited these survivors decades later. All described the same pattern: empty gaze, marked skin, and a phrase repeated in low voice: "I didn't wash. I never washed." Even after the permitted time, many maintained the dried blood on their faces as a perpetual vow of guilt, not by imposition, but because they knew that in that ancestral room the empire had not just punished the body, it had sealed the face, and that not even time dared to touch. But when looking back at the archives of human horror, it becomes impossible not to ask, among so many ways to punish, was this the cruelest of all? Human history is marked by brutal sentences, public impalements in Eastern Europe, ceremonial quarterings among the Aztecs, executions by boiling alive in medieval England, mass amputations in North Africa, crucifixions in the Roman Empire. Each culture in its time developed punishment methods that not only eliminated the body, but destroyed dignity. But even among all these horrors, the Shang dynasty ritual stands out, not just for physical pain, but because the punishment was done with affection. What the Chinese Empire built there was not just a method of repression, it was a doctrine of emotional re-engineering. Making a son eat his own mother's flesh was not just an act of control, it was a complete inversion of the natural order. Life, which should be born from the womb and protected by love, was transformed into sentence. The mother, symbol of origin, was converted into guilt, and the son, symbol of continuity, was forced to become the end. No other civilization took so far the idea that authority is worth more than blood. There are no records of pain greater than that born from guilt without escape. The body heals, shame does not. And this was the true objective of the ritual, to create a man who could never again look at himself without remembering the taste of the flesh that formed him, a punishment that did not end with death, but extended as long as there was memory, as long as there was face, as long as there was night. In historical terms, the Shang believed they were acting in the name of celestial order. For them, obedience to the emperor was the only way to maintain balance between worlds. But in the light of centuries, what we see is more than a rigid tradition. We see an open wound in human history, a chapter written with family blood and sealed with a silence that no rite was able to purify. Perhaps, among all the horrors recorded in the chronicles of ancient empires, this was the only one where executioner and victim shared the same face, the same origin, the same blood. And that is why, even millennia later, the bitter taste of that sentence still has not left history's mouth. And if this chapter seemed unbearable to you, know that there are others, even more silent, buried in the palaces of empires that prefer no one return to read them. What you heard here is not legend, it is not theatre, it is part of a real legacy, of an empire that believed order was worth more than love, that a mother's flesh could be used as sentence, and that a face dirty with blood was more useful to the throne than a repentant heart. If you made it this far, it's because you carry within yourself a rare thirst to know what history preferred to bury. Subscribe now to the channel and activate notifications, because the next accounts go even deeper. In the next video, you will learn the fate of palace eunuchs who were fed blood and forced to smile, even without tongues. And remember, not everything that is ancient is asleep.